Today's talk is the Armenian Genocide Memorial Lecture. And the fund that underwrites the lecture was established in 2005 by Christine Davidian. Christine is currently the co-president of the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide. Besides being very generous to the university in her philanthropy, she performs a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes that often go unnoticed, but keep the lecture series humming. So Christine, I know you're out there. A big thanks to you. In 2005, Christine wanted to ensure that a lecture on the Armenian Genocide was included each year in the Sonoma State Holocaust and Genocide Lecture Series. She solicited donations from Armenians of North Bay, a local heritage organization. The first significant funds came from the Thomas Family Foundation, which is a longtime Armenian American family here in Sonoma County. Significant donations also came from the sale of bricks commemorating the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust and Genocide Memorial Grove on the backside of campus. Now, over the years, more than 20 lectures on the Armenian Genocide have been part of the series. Speakers have included Richard Hovhannissian, Stephen Asturian, Robert Krikorian, and of course, Sergio Laporta, who visited a few weeks ago. Several Armenian filmmakers have also presented their documentaries about the genocide here, including Orphans of the Genocide, which was made for the 100th anniversary commemoration. We also hosted the Bay Area premiere of Women of 1915, as well as the screenings of Crows of the Desert and The Stateless Diplomat, Diana Apkar's heroic life. The Armenian scholar Hazmik Harutyunyan presented her work on recovering lost Armenian lullabies and performed here with the Kitka Women's Vocal Ensemble. Now, Christine Davidian has recently reconfigured her philanthropy by creating the Mary Dalbashian Davidian Armenian Genocide Education Endowment, which will guarantee a steady stream of funds to Armenian programming in future years. Okay, I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker today, who is Ronald Suny. Suny is the William H. Sewell Distinguished University Professor of History Emeritus. Is that correct, Ron? You're emeritus?
Yeah.
And Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Michigan. And he is Emeritus Professor of Political Science and History at the University of Chicago. Now, it's really impossible in a brief introduction to describe Ron's accomplishments. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books. And most of these books all of these books have withstood the hard gaze of scholarly time and remain influential many decades after their first publication. One of these books, and perhaps the one that is most relevant for our purposes today, is the lyrical history of the Armenian Genocide. They can live in the desert, but nowhere else. Over his 60-year career, Ron has foregrounded the experiences of the non-Russian peoples of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. And I think more than any other scholar in my field, he has investigated the intersection of class and national identity and the way those identities played out in the Russian Revolution. Ron's scholarly interests reflect his own family history. His grandfather was the eminent Armenian composer Grigor Suny. His father saw firsthand the Red Army's invasion of Tiflis, which is present-day Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and the collapse of the Democratic Republic of Georgia. So I'll conclude this introduction on a personal note. I first encountered Ron in 1990 or 1991. I'm not sure, and I forgot to check my notes this morning. I was then an undergraduate at the University of Michigan, and I was enrolled in History 434, Ron's course on the history of the Soviet Union. I still have that notebook. More than any other class, Ron's inspired me to become what I am today. And then I was blessed that my time as a PhD student at the University of Chicago corresponded with Ron's time there as a political scientist. So over the years, Ron became not only a mentor, but a friend, a person who I would visit during my occasional trips back to Ann Arbor. So it's with a very deep debt of professional gratitude and profound friendship that I welcome Ron Suny to our virtual podium today. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Steve. That was a wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. You students should appreciate that you have one of the stars of Russian history, one of our star students at Michigan and Chicago as your professor in this course. And it's a pleasure, and I want to thank the sponsors also who have made this lecture possible. I'm going to do something that may be difficult, but I'm going to try to lead you through a discussion of the word genocide, show you its difficulties, why it should be defended, and how studying the Armenian genocide of 1915-1916, in fact, helps us understand this concept. That word genocide has become an extraordinarily potent key word in international political discourse, in law and scholarship on mass violence. But some analysts contend it causes more problems than it solves. And I think one of the most recent and profound critiques of the word and the concept comes, in my opinion, from the Australian historian Dirk, who, in a thorough investigation of the problems of genocide, that's the name of his book, offers the most profound analysis and account of the use of the concept and an argument that he tries to make for an alternative term, permanent security. That's what I'm going to look at. Now, Dirk, who's a colleague and a friend, kindly sent me his big book, 511 pages, with a nice inscription, "To Ron, friend and comrade, warmly Dirk." I hefted the book and thought, gee, maybe I can skim this book. No, Dirk's book is not a book you can skim. So I did, here, listen to this, students, what I've done with too many books. I read it, every page, with a ruler and a pen in hand, underlining what I needed to know and remember. And I read a lot. I read a lot because that's what I do for a living. I read and write and teach. And seldom in all my reading have I learned so much from a single book. Certainly not since reading Capital Volume 1 in the late 1960s. I soon realized that this book was advancing the debate about genocide far beyond the stagnant meanderings around what Raphael Lemkin, the inventor of the word, might have meant, or how we get around the United Nations Genocide Convention. Genocide is a key word in the usage of the Marxist literary and social critic Raymond Williams, that is, one of the building blocks of political discourse, constituting general vocabulary ranging from strong and difficult and persuasive words in everyday usage to words like genocide, which, beginning in particular specified, specialized contexts, have become quite common in descriptions of wider areas of thought and experience. In other words, the word genocide has cut loose from its original moorings and become the crime of crimes, a designation that states wantonly that it can accuse all kinds of things and is used very widely to accuse your enemies, but not what you do. And some scholars have stretched that term to include all kinds of crimes against humanity. Now, Dirk Moses's analysis is serious and sophisticated, and the tone of the book can hardly contain the author's passion about the subject, his pain at what is being done in the name of what he calls permanent security, but does not have a name. That is, we don't use that term in this way that Moses wants us to use it. Now, let me tell you what Dirk Moses's argument is. Then I'm going to talk about the Armenian genocide, and then I'm going to see if what he's advocating helps us to understand the genocide and a way we might use that term more usefully. First, Moses contends that genocide as a word distorts our thinking about civilian, non-combat destruction. Genocide narrows the definition of what is the crime of crimes, and it leaves out things like aerial bombing or massacres of certain types or ethnic cleansing. It leaves out so much and has been lifted in professional, legal, and popular discourse above those other kinds of crimes. So genocide, he writes, captures public attention in a way that war crimes and crimes against humanity do not. And I end quote. Now, secondly, Moses argues, genocide is too narrow a concept, or it focuses on a single form of mass violence, namely violence directed against ethnic, religious, or racial groups, crimes based on hatred of people with specific identities. So keep that in mind. And third, he considers that such violence is thought of as non-political. And the distinction between genocidal and political violence, genocidal is thought of as non-political, blinds us to civilian destruction in general and the circumstances that produce it. The UN Convention on Genocide has entrenched the virtually untrammeled sovereignty of states in their internal affairs and a relatively free hand in waging such things as aerial warfare abroad. Consequently, the depoliticizing effect of the genocide concepts allows states to legally kill civilians in the name of national interest or raison d'etat. Since the 1940s, when the crime of aggression was actually the crime of crimes, and that was actually the crime that the Nazis were accused of at Nuremberg, they had started the Second World War, and crimes of humanity included various crimes, mass crimes against civilians. Since that time, the particular crime of genocide, which was defined in World War II, has gained primacy of place. The tragic effect of elevating genocide to crime of crimes has been that other forms of mass killing have become acceptable in actual state practices and justified as means to the end of self-protection, military necessity, or as appropriate means of dealing with terrorists. Especially pernicious, in Dirk's view and in my own, is that such crimes are committed not only by authoritarian or so-called totalitarian regimes, but also by self-styled liberal democracies in the name of preserving humanity and civilization. Genocide has been distinguished not only from interstate war, but from certain intrastate conflicts like civil wars, rebellions, and insurrections. In the UN Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, this is the 1948 convention, genocide is defined in the following ways. And take this definition very seriously, because it's the one I think we should hold on to. It's a legal concept, and it's very helpful for scholars as well. Genocide is defined as, let me quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Those two words, as such, are important too. Unquote. Governments get around genocide by claiming that they're not acting on the basis of hate, but in the name of security, of self-preservation, of self-defense, of military necessity, and they're opposing terrorists. By fixating on crimes based on ethnic and racial hatred, genocide excludes most civilian destruction in an age like ours since 1945, when most conflicts have been internal to states rather than interstate conflicts. Since 1945, most wars and killing are civil wars, ethnic conflicts, ethnic cleansings, etc. And most victims have not been soldiers, warriors, combatants, but non-combatants, civilians. We live in an age of total war, whereas you're seeing in Gaza today, it's more dangerous to be a civilian than an actual combatant. Therefore, Dirk Moses concludes the genocide concept should be replaced by a more general crime of permanent security. Central to Moses's historical analysis is what he calls the language of transgression. That is, that people think, oh my goodness, this is a terrible thing. They're shocked by it. Their conscience is upset. Humanity, civilization is threatened by barbarism. And you hear these terms all the time. Those we have to destroy are savages or animals, not real humans. Certain crimes are particularly shocking to civilized people. Contrasts between the civilized and the barbaric and the savage, as I've observed in the book I'm currently working on nations and nationalism, go back to ancient times. They've been around forever. They're ubiquitous. But this language of transgression, this idea of transgression, this idea of shock at barbarians challenging civilization is not only ancient, but it's a Eurocentric discourse, and it tends to elide crimes by the very powers that generated and promoted the concept of genocide. A very powerful contribution by Moses, I believe, is the distinction between two kinds of permanent security, liberal and illiberal. Now, he defines illiberal security as being like that of the Nazi state, which was unconcerned with international law or claims of universal morality, and did not at all distinguish between civilians and combatants. It treated enemies as a whole, it treated peoples as a whole as enemies. So if some part of a people did something awful, you simply generalize that to the whole people, and then you could destroy the whole people. Killing women and children makes sense in seeking illiberal permanent security, because women reproduce the children who grow up to become enemies. So genocide is a process seeking this kind of illiberal permanent security. And the young Turks who carry out the Armenian genocide will be precisely those kinds of illiberal permanent security seekers. Only by destroying future generations can permanent security be achieved. So the architect of the Armenian genocide, a man named Talat Pasha, Pasha just means general, Talat Pasha explained why his forces murdered children, and he said this: "Those who are innocent today might be guilty tomorrow," unquote. In other words, this illiberal permanent security is tied to a bounded territoriality. But then there's something equally pernicious, which Dirk calls liberal permanent security. And that concept extends everywhere in the name of humanity. This would include the civilizing missions of empires, which excused its crimes in the name of higher and lower cultures and the greater good of humanity. The white man's burden to civilize the uncivilized, to keep the barbarians at the gates, far from home where they might do damage. But some of these efforts also occur with liberal permanent security, for if the enemy is considered horrific enough, then mass killing can be justified in the name of military necessity, or making the world safe for whatever you consider best, making the world safe for democracy, for capitalism, the United States as a global hegemon. The United States considers itself the indispensable nation. Killing non-combatants, then, is euphemized as, in the United States, collateral damage. Try to remember, students, that the power that has killed more people outside its own country since 1945 is none other than the United States. Millions of people in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Latin America. One of Moses's strongest objections to the concept of genocide is directed not so much against genocide as such. He actually uses the word genocide and refers to events that are genocidal. But he criticized the way the concept of genocide has been conflated with the concept of the Holocaust itself. The Holocaust, the Judaicide by the Nazis against the Jews during the Second World War. Moses shows that since the Nuremberg trials and the UN Genocide Convention, the concept of genocide has steadily merged with the model of the Holocaust, so that genocide is defined as the mass killing of innocent victims who presented no real danger to the state, who were not treacherous or rebellious. Jews were murdered en masse, but they had not rebelled, and they even were ready to be loyal Germans, Poles, Soviets, or whatever. So they were totally innocent victims, and that becomes one of the criteria of genocide in the model of genocide following the Holocaust. Moses refers to this as a tidy dramaturgy of the Holocaust, which shows utterly innocent victims and monstrous perpetrators bent on total extermination. And the Holocaust is conceived as an apolitical crime. It's not about putting down rebellion or something like that. It's simply a matter of racial hatred from which there is no escape for the targets of the Nazis' virulent exterminationist anti-Semitism. Now, in the 2 decades between the Armenian genocide and the Nazi Judaicide, the 1920s and 1930s, our earlier genocide, the Armenian genocide of 1915. That's a genocide before there was even a word invented by the Polish Jewish jurist Raphael Lemkin. That is, he invented that word. That Armenian genocide was seen as the great crime against humanity. And actually, the word Holocaust was used to describe it before Holocaust with a capital H came to mean the Nazi Judaicide. That term, genocide, was then applied to the massacres of Ottoman Armenians by the, I'm sorry, not the word genocide, but Holocaust, by the Allied powers in May 1915. And the first usage of the term crime against humanity in international diplomacy was used by the Allies in May 1915 to describe the Ottoman massacres of Armenians. We didn't have the word genocide then. Now, the effect after the Holocaust was to try to bring the Armenian genocide together with the Holocaust. And Armenian scholars particularly have tried to show that Armenians were also innocent victims of the perpetrators, namely the Ottoman Turks. But actually, as a historian, and in my book, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, A History of the Armenian Genocide, available on Amazon, not too expensive, you can go get it. They're really different because European Jews were innocent and agentless. They didn't have a way to act against the Nazis, and they had not much resisted what happened to them. They were targeted solely on racial grounds. And in this crime, in the Holocaust template, they were killed without cause, except racial hatred by the perpetrators, Hitler and the Nazis. And that crime of innocence without cause was elevated to a higher level that mass killings might have political means or political causes and motivations. Like, let's say, the Palestinians' resistance to the Israeli occupation, or Kurdish resistance against Turkish repressions at the present, or the Armenians resisting the Turkish and Kurdish predations in the Ottoman genocide, where they actually did resist and were politically active. There, Armenians had agency, and therefore the innocent thing doesn't work in quite the same way. Now, in order to fit the new archetype of genocide sanctified by the Holocaust, genocide scholars, particularly Armenians, struggled hard to portray these Armenians, as I mentioned, as agentless, innocent victims murdered on the basis of their ethno-religious identity. Certainly, their identity was part of it, but other things were going on, as I'll explain. These scholars played down their own Armenian revolutionary movement, their own resistance to Ottoman repression and Kurdish attacks on Armenian villagers. In other words, to qualify fully for genocide after the Holocaust concept became dominant, a crime had to be based on hatred of an identity group rather than their political activity. And Moses says, and I believe this exactly, this is more than a disservice to history. It has had dire real-world consequences. The bar for humane atrocities to be considered a genocide is now so extraordinarily high that it's difficult to reach. And you can see the International Court for Justice attempting and arguing about whether or not what the Israelis are doing in Gaza is in fact a genocide. That high bar has been used often by deniers of the Armenian genocide and of other mass killings that do not reach the new level and contours of the Holocaust. And this is certainly a widespread way of justifying genocide. Now, a kind of confession. I first gave a version of this lecture at UCLA in April last year, so a year ago. And I distinguished between, appropriately, I think, genocide and ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is the removal of a population from a territory by force. Killing sometimes gets involved because the perpetrators, the ones carrying out ethnic cleansing, want the land, but they do not want the people on the land. Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity, but it is not genocide because it does not involve mass killing of a people to destroy that people in whole or in part and make it impossible. And here's where I think the definition of genocide comes in. Genocide is when the perpetrators make it impossible for a people being destroyed to reproduce their existence, their culture, their nation, and maybe even the possibility of forming a state. That would make it genocide. Genocide against women and children is understandable because all genocides are gender genocides, and they're about reproduction of human beings, cultures, and nations. So you've got to get the women and children. At the time I spoke a year ago, I made sure to distinguish between Israeli long-term policy toward Palestinians, which began as violent ethnic cleansing in the Nakba of 1948, that is the expulsion of roughly 700,000 or 800,000 Palestinians from what is now the state of Israel and turning them into permanent refugees. And I used the terms colonialism, ethnic cleansing, occupation, with the possible intention of further ethnic cleansing. But here's my confession. A year later, in the present time, after the horrific and inexcusable Hamas massacres of October 7th, 2023, with the existence now in power of an extreme right-wing government of Bibi Netanyahu, what that government has engaged in my opinion, and the opinion of many, has metastasized into genocide. Wanton civilian killing, now numbering 33,000 people, more than half of them women and children. Aerial bombing, using, by the way, American 2,000-pound bombs, which we have continued to supply Israel with. Wanton destruction of whole neighborhoods, hospitals, schools, humanitarian institutions in Gaza as an effort to eliminate Hamas has risen to and now passed the bar of the UN definition of genocide. This conclusion then makes our lecture today, the question of whether it's a genocide or not, and my own conviction that something seriously has crossed the line, particularly relevant because the whole world at this moment is watching on their televisions at night a genocide taking place in real time. And these events are having global effects on humanity and on the international security system. So now I want to turn to the Armenian genocide itself and its history and see how we can think about this concept genocide and see where it takes us, since most scholars and legal institutions and the UN definition all recognize the Armenian genocide as a genocide. I begin my analysis of the Armenian genocide with what was then known as the Great War, which is World War I, a catastrophe for all the peoples of the Ottoman Empire, and most completely for the Armenians and the Assyrians, a related Christian group. Of the more than 20 million subjects of the Sultan, perhaps as many as 5 million would perish as a result of the young Turk government's decision to join what was for them a war of choice rather than a war of necessity. Some 800,000 would be killed, over half of them to disease. The mortality rate would for everyone would be about 25%. Only Serbia would suffer a loss greater percentage-wise than the Ottomans. Most of the victims were civilians. At the end of World War I, 18% of the Muslims, that is Turks and Kurds and some Arabs, of Anatolia, the peninsula in which Armenia is included, would die, 18%. And they would die as casualties of battle launched by their own government, famine, disease, and governmental disorganization. But of the Armenians, 90% would be gone by the end of the war, deported, massacred, and forcibly converted to Islam or exiled beyond the borders of the new Turkish Republic. The Young Turk government entered the war to save or even enhance their empire, but they in fact presided over its demise. And the war laid the foundation for the successor of the empire. The empire was, of course, a multinational state, and they allowed, after the war, a Turkish nationalist movement to develop. They had already largely ethnically cleansed the heartland of the Turks in the genocide. They had mobilized millions of ordinary Muslims to fight for their fatherland, which is the current state of Turkey. In Turkey's collective memory today, writes Turkish historian Mustafa Aksakal, the Ottomans lost the First World War. The Turks won it. So what you find is that the war and the genocide of the Armenians made possible an ethno-national Turkish republic on the lands of that multinational empire. We've moved from empire to ethno-national state. And the fate of the Armenians is directly tied to the making possibility this new state. In other words, modern Turkey is founded on a foundational crime, the crime of genocide, which, as you could understand, the Turks of today, officially and in their schools, refuse to recognize. Now, many states are also founded on the dispersion, ethnic cleansing, and even genocide of the indigenous native peoples. Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, as a matter of fact. What better way to create the most rich and powerful nation in the world than to disperse the people who were here before, take their land from them without compensation, great wealth, and then import African slaves to work the land. That is free labor, free land for white people from Europe, right? This is what Karl Marx calls the primitive accumulation of capital. We can call it the most primitive accumulation of capital of all in Turkey or in America. Take everything from the locals, get rid of them, and build your own country and economy. So you see how important this concept of genocide and ethnic cleansing can be, and how those concepts are related to the formation of modern nation states. So I'm arguing then that the Great War was not simply a clash of armies in the field, but a total war in which civilians suffered as much, if not more, than combatants, and led to new kinds of states at the end. Now, what were, in fact, the Young Turks about? What did they think they were doing? Well, they went to war. They joined the Germans, not the British and French or Russians. They were the enemies, because the Germans agreed to look the other way while the Turks, the Ottomans, did what they will with the Armenians. The French, the British, and the Russians, in fact, condemned what the Turks did and wanted reforms in the Ottoman Empire to protect the Armenians, though they never followed through on that. The Armenians were caught. They were in what I call the dilemma of the damned. No matter what they did, they would be destroyed. So the Turks say the Armenians resisted, and there was some resistance, or that the Armenians defected, because there were Armenians across the border in Russia. And maybe those Armenians preferred Russia, a Christian nation, to the Turkish-Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim nation. But in my own research for my book, I showed that the major Armenian institutions before and early in the war of 1914, 1915, in fact, mobilized young Armenians to fight for the Ottoman Empire, to join the Ottoman army against Russia, against the enemies of the Sultan. So rather than being a massive rebellion of Armenians against the state, which is what current Turkish deniers argue, falsely making it up, in fact, tens of thousands of young Armenians fought in the Ottoman Empire's armies against their enemies. But in the very first winter of that war, the end of 1914-1915, the Ottomans lost a major battle at a place called Sarıkamış in eastern Anatolia, and they blamed the Armenians for their defeat because some Armenians had defected to the Russians, a minority, and in fact there were Armenians on the Russian side, Russian subjects of the Tsar, who were fighting against the Turks. And after that battle of Sarıkamış, the government of the Sultan, the Young Turk government, decided to disarm the Armenian soldiers, to strip them of their uniforms, turn them into work battalions, and eventually to murder them, have them dig their own graves and destroy them. So the first thing they did was remove the muscle of the Armenian people, which made real rebellion or real insurrection impossible. The second thing they did in 1915, on April 24th, was arrest the leading politicians, literary figures, and so forth of the Armenian community, arrest them, deport them, and eventually murder them as well. In other words, you've removed the muscle, now you decapitate the nation. And after carrying that out and making any serious rebellion impossible, then the Young Turks began deporting hundreds of thousands of Armenians from the cities in which they lived into the deserts of Syria, where they would starve to death and eventually be massacred as well. Some hundreds of thousands of children and women were not destroyed immediately, but were converted to Islam and exist even today, that is, as Muslims, or at least their children and grandchildren in current day Turkey. Because some Armenians had defected or resisted, the actions of those few signified the guilt of the collective whole. Within the way the Young Turks were thinking, the important Ottoman leaders, shared by overwhelming numbers of Ottoman Muslims, the Armenians represented a real, palpable threat to their future existence. Where the Europeans saw the Armenians as victims, the Ottomans saw themselves as victims, both of Europe and of the treacherous Armenians. Despite the fact that Armenians had served in the Ottoman army, despite the fact that their political parties and their church had urged them to loyally participate in the defense of the empire, the Young Turk government, the architects of the genocide, were convinced that all Armenians were potentially disloyal, likely to be pro-Russian, and therefore measures had to be taken to neutralize them. We know of parallel situations in Russia and the Soviet Union where Germans and Jews were considered potential traitors and were dealt with as such. And even in the United States during World War II, Japanese Americans were deported for the possible disloyalty they might have as given their ethnicity. Armenian leaders were caught between joining the army and being loyal and the suspicions of the Young Turks that they were untrustworthy and therefore they should be destroyed. And indeed, that is how this genocide occurred. The Ottomans organized it. They used Kurds as agents, and the country sank into this mass killing and deportations from 1915 into 1916. After the initial massacres, the Young Turks, in fact, did stir up the Armenians to resist. The city of Van, which is the one city in eastern Turkey where Armenians had either a majority or a plurality, did resist, held off the Ottoman troops until they were rescued by the Russians. And when the Russians retreated, those Armenians went with them. But note the chronology. Historians believe chronology is your friend. The chronology is that first Turkish massacres occurred. Then the Armenians resisted, not the other way around. Turkish deniers say, look, there was a rebellion in Van, and then we attacked. They started it. It's their fault. There was no genocide, say the Turks, and the Armenians are to blame for it. For the Armenians of Van, this was a moment of resistance. And Armenians call this the defense of Van. The Young Turks and current denialists in Turkey call it the Van Rebellion or the Van Insurrection. But indeed, there was no revolt. There was no organized uprising. There was no coordinated Armenian insurrection led by the remnants of the Armenian population, which was being systematically destroyed. Eventually, 1 million or more people would die, Armenians would die in this event. In other words, the purported rebellion was a fiction concocted and spread by the military communiques until there was a synthesized myth about Armenian rebellion. But we have documents and documents. Very interesting, the memoirs and the notes sent back to the State Department by the then American ambassador to Turkey. America was neutral in that particular conflict at the time, 1915. We didn't join World War I until 1917. And in his memoirs, Ambassador Henry Morgenthau, who was a friend of Talat Pasha, the architect of the genocide, recalls a conversation with Talat in which Talat explained to him what we were doing to the Armenians and why. Let me just read to you briefly the most important part of that conversation. Here's Talat talking to the American ambassador. I've asked you to come today so that I can explain our position on the whole Armenian subject. We base our objections to the Armenians on 3 distinct grounds. In the first place, they have enriched themselves at the expense of the Turks. In the second place, they are determined to domineer over us and establish a separate state. In the third place, they have openly encouraged our enemies. They have assisted the Russians in the Caucasus, and our failure there is largely explained by their actions. We have therefore come to the irrevocable conclusion that we must make them powerless before the war ends. Now, I'm very interested in emotions in politics. And if you think of the emotions that Talat frankly expresses, one is resentment. These Armenians have gotten something they don't deserve, but that we deserve. They have been successful at the expense of the Turks. And Armenians, many of them did well in that empire as a middle-class element. Anxiety is an emotion here about the future, in which the Muslims would be under the heel of the unbelievers, of the Armenians. There's anger expressed at the betrayal of the Armenians, their affiliation with the Russians, and there's fear that Armenians favored by Europe were precisely the thin edge of the wedge to bring down the empire. So Ambassador Morgenthau said, what you're doing is a disaster. You'll only destroy your own empire. Talat cut him off and said, there's no use for you to argue. We have already disposed of 3/4 of the Armenians. There are none at all left in Bitlis, Van, and Erzurum. The hatred between the Turks and the Armenians is so intense now that we've got to finish with them. If we don't, they will plan their revenge. In other words, Talat was arguing for what Dirk Moses calls permanent security by any means necessary, including mass killing. I am not arguing that all Turks or that the Ottoman Empire in some abstract way caused the genocide. I'm not even arguing that young Turks who made the revolution in 1908 are the architects of the genocide. But a small minority of young Turks, militants who took power, Talat was the leader, Enver Pasha, Cemal Pasha, in January of 1913, a minority of these leaders, the most radical, are the ones who carried out this particular event. I've argued that the genocide was not planned long in advance. It was a contingent reaction to a moment of crisis. But what I'm going to argue now is that it was not particularly religiously motivated. Armenians were marked by being Christians, but other Christians like Greeks were not marked at that moment to be destroyed. But it was about permanent security. Armenians were conceived as an enemy. So I'm going to argue that the Armenian genocide was the result of long-term, deep-seated elite and popular hatreds, resentments, fears, and anxieties intensified by war and defeat at what I call an affective disposition, an emotional environment in which Armenians were perceived as irredeemable enemies of Muslims and the empire. The choice of genocide was not inevitable, but it was the result of the ways the Ottoman leaders, at least those militants, and more ordinary people imagined who the Armenians were and what the threat to the empire was. Therefore, I call this a delusional rationality. That is, they conceive of the Armenians as a myth of some kind, that they believe this is a danger. I've tried to show in ways in which they weren't, right? And in their own exaggerated emotional state, they begin to carry out this horrendous policy. Now, I would make a case for the Holocaust in a similar way, that it was the delusional rationality of the Nazis that somehow Jews were a virus by their very existence, who were undermining the Aryan race, completely nutty idea based on deep racism, that led to the mass murder of 6 million Jews, right? And it was these delusional realities that led to the mass killing. So what does then the Armenian genocide, in my last 5 minutes, tell us about the concept of genocide and the concept of permanent security? This was an event perpetrated by a regime that sought permanent security against an imagined threat. The threat was defined in ethno-religious terms. The threat came from the mind of the Ottomans, leaders, who had constructed in their own eyes and minds that Armenians and Assyrians were mortal enemies, existential threats. The crimes were not of purely innocent people, as in the Holocaust, but of people with agency and their own political ambitions. The crimes were complexly political because the goal of the perpetrators in their own delusional reality was to target a defined group and destroy them for the purpose of securing the empire for all time. Moses, in a way, is correct that we shouldn't think of genocide as the crime of crimes, which makes us a pernicious hierarchy of crimes. Where do you put Hiroshima in this? It's not a genocide. Is that worse or less worse than a genocide? Where do you put aerial bombing of Gaza civilians who are trapped by blockade by the Israelis and like fish in a fishbowl being destroyed from the air by American bombs? What do you do with the crushing of insurrections, blockades, occupations, etc.? What do you do with populations like Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, or Kurds in eastern Turkey being repressed by the Turks? So I want to keep the word genocide because there are such events, and we're not going to get rid of that word. As laudable as Moses' goal may be, it is not very practical. The word genocide is here to stay in law and language, but what we can do is clarify the term, at least by scholars and lawyers, if not yet the general public, and self-interested state actors. But you need to make that term clear and precise, limit its use, and elevate the other crimes against humanity and war crimes to an equal level. Now, the Armenian case clearly meets many of these criteria, but not others. But it is still a genocide by the UN definition. And this is a useful one, because what is a genocide? It is the initiated and deliberate and intentional killing, not of people, but of a people, a designated racial, ethno-religious, whatever category. And that term is not expressed well in English. It is in the term genocide, killing of a people, or it is in German, Völkermord, killing of a people. It's very good in Armenian, Tsehaspanuchun, killing of a race or a people. And even in Turkish, soykırım is the murder of a race. And so everything is not genocide, right? And there's some events that look like genocide and smell like genocide. They're genocidal in a way, but they're not, they don't quite fit this definition. So we need to stick close, it seems to me, to the UN definition. It's the best one we have. It limits the spread and the weakening, the diluting of this concept. And we can distinguish between genocides. The Holocaust is different from the Armenian genocide, but both are about the killing, destruction, making impossible to reproduce a nation, a people, a culture. And so that becomes important. Dirk Moses is certainly right to reject the hierarchy that places genocide in the template of the Holocaust, innocent victims defined racially as the crime of crimes, and elevating that there are other crimes like aggression and like what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, etc., which may not be genocide, to that level. The power of his argument is to turn our attention to other crimes that states and movements commit in their drive for permanent security. Ethnic cleansing, aerial bombing, brutal attacks in the name of war, on terrorism. You know what terrorists are. Terrorists are the ones you aren't. They're the ones you hate. And you can call anyone a terrorist. But we also should maintain that genocide is a real phenomenon, not to be merged into other crimes against humanity and not to be placed above them, but to be specified and explained. It seems to me that's what the Armenian genocide does. Why do states and movements turn against and decide to eliminate as much as possible ethnic, religious, and racial groups? The Armenian genocide, I submit, helps us move to show the delusions, the imagined threats. Threats are usually imagined in one way or other. They're perceptions, not real things, that in fact generate the kinds of hatreds, resentments, anger, and fear that will lead people to massively kill another. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. So now we segue to questions. And by tradition, the right to first question belongs to a student. Anybody brave enough to ask a question? So Ron, can I ask you a question? And I know this is something you and I have talked about before. Does Moses's distinction between genocide and permanent security play into the way we understand Soviet brutality, Stalinist brutality?
I think so. I think so. Let me start with Putin, and then I'll go back to Stalin. Certainly, Putin is this whole war, which is unnecessary with Ukraine, a war that's nikomu nie нужна. It's needed by no one, not by Russians, not by Ukrainians, was in fact an idea that we can, by pushing NATO backwards, they came after us, we can create some kind of permanent security. And what Putin has done is create a new Russian insecurity. He's lost on every front, even though he's still occupying a good 20% of Ukraine. Now, Stalin is a very interesting figure. I wrote a big book, 800 and some pages, about just Stalin up to the revolution. I hope with my colleague, Louis Siegelbaum, to somehow finish the second volume. We'll see. Stalin was very shrewd. And Stalin also wanted permanent security, of course. And the way he achieved it was this overwhelming victory in the Second World War. So who won the Second World War in Europe? Who defeated the Nazi state? What power was faced by 75% of the German and allies, Germany armies? The Soviet Union. What country lost 27 million people in that war? What country seized Berlin and destroyed the Nazi hierarchy? And finally, what power? It was the Red Army that ended the Holocaust, that liberated Auschwitz. That's the day you celebrate as holiday, as Holocaust Memorial Day. It's the day the Red Army entered Auschwitz. It was the Soviet Union. And what the Soviets did with their victory was turn it into an empire external to their own country of Eastern European states and the Warsaw Bloc to hold off the rest of the world, because the Soviet Union was far weaker than the United States and eventually by revived Western Europe. So in his ambition for permanent security, Stalin isolated the Soviet Union, forced the Soviets and the so-called socialist bloc to rely on its own resources, and it remained backward and isolated from the world capitalist system.
Other questions? Yeah, so my MA student, very sharp, Rosanna has a question. So Rosanna, speak loud.
Is this loud enough?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
loud enough.
Dr. Suny, thank you so much for your talk. I am curious, though, I wonder if this is going to move us too far from the specific content of your talk. So if that's the case, you don't have to answer this, but we did have a talk a few weeks ago. Sergio Laporta was here, and the title of his talk was The Armenian Genocide is History Repeating Itself, and it was about Nagorno-Karabakh. And I have seen in the coverage that the word genocide is being used to describe the events in Karabakh now. And I can't recall if Dr. Laporta specifically said that towards the end of his talk, but I'm curious, given what you've just told us about keeping a strict definition of genocide, if you'd be willing to share your take on whether or not the events in Karabakh would qualify.
The events in Karabakh are a disastrous, radical, forced ethnic cleansing of that territory where Armenians lived for millennia, thousands and thousands of years. But the Azerbaijanis who carried out that ethnic cleansing were very shrewd. They did not carry out mass killing. They even very duplicitously said, we want the Armenians to stay. And the Armenians but knew what would happen if they stayed. And so 150,000, that was how many were left at the end, left and went to Armenia and to other places. So it's definitely ethnic cleansing. It does not reach the level of genocide, which would be a kind of total destruction by mass killing. Now, I could see how people could say that the specific Karabakh culture is now gone. It lives in exile, if at all. But that is not the same, it seems to me, as a genocide. But there you can see some of the vague borders of the definition which might apply. No, I'm careful about this. I'm going to tell you something that may upset a lot of people. I'm sorry about that. But I've been very critical of the loose use of the word genocide for what the Russians are doing in Ukraine today. I don't think it's genocide. There are war crimes. There are crimes against humanity. Putin is a war criminal. There was aggression. There's all kinds of things. The issue is up for grabs right now. There's capturing and kidnapping of some kinds of children, which is very hard to clarify. So the story is still open, but I would not call it genocide. I would also not call the Holodomor of the 1930s a genocide. It was something that occurred during collectivization. It was horrific. It was artificial. It was done by the Soviet state, but it was not about killing Ukrainians as Ukrainians. It was about pressuring Ukrainians to give up grain, not die. And it was carried out so badly and so crudely and so cruelly that 5 to 7 million people died. So it's genocidal, or it's a horrific, it's a war crime, it's a crime against humanity, but it does not fit the definition of the UN definition on genocide.
Hey, so we have some, Ron, I don't know if you can see in the Q&A, we have some questions there. So somebody has typed in, do you see Trump's rhetoric against immigrants along the US southern border as, quote, genocidal, given that he calls them animals and other similar terms?
You know, I think that the questionnaire, the anonymous attendee, is actually pointing out a distinction that's worth making. A thing doesn't have to be a real genocide and fit the tight definition of genocide for it not to be genocidal. And I think you could say that there is rhetoric, and many people in Russia, particularly the media and the horrendous Armenian Marietta Simonyan, head of RTTV, have used rhetoric that sounds genocidal. Certainly, the former president of Russia, Medvedev, uses it. And Putin and Trump very much uses and elevates this kind of language and has made it normal to a large degree so that our whole discourse of language has now become so virulent that these things are now possible to call them animals, disease-ridden, etc. And in Israel as well. Unfortunately, in Israel, even government officials have used the word animal, subhuman, and so forth to describe people of Gaza or Hamas, etc. And equated, by the way, Hamas with general Palestinians so that you can kill without distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. And it is the duty, by the way, according to the UN Convention, of governments, it's their duty, they're required to resist anything provoking genocide, including genocidal language, let alone aerial bombing and mass killing of the type we're watching, both in Ukraine and in Gaza. And the United States is now on a sword's edge, trying to decide what to do. And hopefully the President of the United States, who seems to be a decent man, will come to the conclusion that there has to be a total ceasefire and that we have to stop supplying weapons there. But he has not made that move yet. But I'm very proud of the state of Michigan, where we were able, many of us, to vote uncommitted, to put pressure on him, because Michigan is a decisive state, not California, in the coming election. And maybe he will respond to that call.
So I see somebody has their hand up in Zoom. Because we're set up as a webinar, you have to type your question into the chat. So one of the Alliance members whom you'll meet later, Todd, writes, at a recent lecture at USC, University of London scholar Dan Stone stated, the Holocaust did not simply end in 1945, and the Armenian genocide has also not ended in our time. Has the world overlooked this reality, and how can remembrance reclaim this aspect of the post-war world? So I think this is a question about commemoration.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I very much respect the work of Dan Stone. I've read his work and used it, but I'm not sure what he means it didn't stop. I see these as events, and I don't want to extend things as if what the horrors of the Nazis somehow continued without end. They ended in 1945, and the Armenian genocide ended in 1916 or 1917 or whatever. That doesn't mean that discrimination and other kinds of events didn't occur afterwards up to the present time. Anti-Semitism, of course, is prevalent and even virulent at the moment, and it must be condemned in all its forms. Lenin called it the socialism of fools. But nevertheless, I would stick again to the events themselves, which have causes, effects, and explanations. If we don't extend these terms so that they become meaningless and vapid.
So we have a question here from faculty member. So please introduce yourself and ask your question.
My name is Jennifer, and I teach in the dance department here and also in the university studies freshman department. So I have a question about the role of intention. I know that some of the definitions have the term intent, and I'm wondering if, since you were making the really strong distinction between Israel's behavior previously as ethnic cleansing, but now genocide in the war, do you think the intention has changed, or it's just the amount of refusal to stop with the destruction and civilian casualties? Or do you think that intention has to change? Because I know you said with Armenia, there wasn't this premeditated intention.
I'll start with the Armenian case. In the Armenian case, there was hatred and there was building up, and it eventually at a moment, that radical Young Turk faction that came to power in January 1913 decided, and intentionally decided, after the Battle of Sadi Kamish, to carry out this mass killing, right? And that occurred. And the behavior of the state shows that indeed this was both intention and the result of what happened. That's pretty clear. There's no question with the Holocaust, what the Nazis intended. It began with the Wannsee Conference, was organized, and it was carried out. The Israeli case is more difficult because I would argue that given Israel's founding, ethnic cleansing is there from the beginning, but there were different moments when one could tolerate and even deal with Palestinians in a variety of ways. No Israeli government was ever willing to sanction, without qualification, a Palestinian state. Even Rabin said, I'm not going to give a Palestinian state. There'll be some entity of some kind. That's what he said to the Knesset. And from the Netanyahu period on, so we're talking the last decades or so, this has become more and more clear that there will be no Palestinian state, that the lands of the West Bank will be settled, now 500,000 Israeli Jews in that area, and repeatedly the attempt by Gazans to rebuild their society. The Israelis were against moving from tents to buildings originally, tried to prevent that. Every few years, there'd be bombing and aerial destruction of Gaza, and the Gazans under Hamas resisted and sent rockets to Israel, creating this escalation of fears and anxieties, which have made the Israelis very much not only hostile to Palestinians, but supportive of Netanyahu's war overwhelmingly. But at a certain point, in order to stay in power, and given what happened on October 7th, a possibility existed suddenly that one could resolve the Palestinian question in a new way. And that way was to really reduce the potency, the unity, the existence of Palestinians so radically through mass killing that they could not reproduce themselves. There'd be no hope for a state. There'd be encouragement for fleeing from these areas, and there are efforts to drive them out of Gaza and the West Bank. Now there's been constraint by the West and by the United States to some degree, so we may see a change. And there have been open statements of the government and of the right-wing forces and so forth that this is a way of solving this problem. So I think there is an intent. The intent isn't fixed in stone. This intent is not written in a document. These things aren't made that clearly. But actions belie intentions as well as words. And I mentioned it before that if you focus very narrowly on definitions, then you might use those technicalities to deny genocides. And the Turks have done this right up to the present time. Well, there was rebellion. We never intended to, in fact, carry out the killing of the Armenians. We just sent them to the desert or whatever. So I don't dispute that one can play with those things and argue in different ways. But it's hard to resist the conclusion, which I came to extremely reluctantly, and many of my colleagues and so forth, who I respect, refuse to go that far, that we've moved to something new. And the only power that can stop this from becoming truly genocide, you could say it's genocidal now, but I say genocide, it's truly genocide, fully genocide, is the United States. And we have to see whether this government, in an election year, calculating its risks and advantages, will actually carry that out. In other words, my friends, we as Americans are complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians, as we have been complicit for decades in supporting Israel and the ethnic cleansing and the repression and the occupation, as every power in the Middle East will tell you.